Oh, there we go. All right. All right. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Renee. Thank you, Renee. Great to have you here this month.
No worries. So yes, thank you everybody for coming along. There's a few familiar faces. Thank you for supporting me. And this talk is something that I've put together. So there's, like I said, there's a global Scrum gathering in Portugal in October. And I submitted this idea for this talk a couple of months ago and didn't ever think it would get accepted. And it did. So I'm not going in person, but I have pre-recorded one, which they're hosting on their online hybrid portal thing. So to buy a ticket to get access to that. So yeah, this is kind of a preview, but it's also a practice. For me, it's still relatively new. From when I found out about it being accepted, which was like the first week of August, until when I had to submit it to the portal, which was the end of August. I had 3.5 weeks to put it together. So it's still relatively new. This is the first time I'm doing it in person, not pre-recorded. In its pretty state, I had 3 sprints before I recorded it for the conference. So yeah, this is sprint 4. I'm very open to feedback so I can improve it for future delivery, future audiences. But I'll shut up and I'll share my screen with sound. Yes, thank you. So hopefully you can see that, my nice big yellow screen. Can you see that? I can't see anybody now.
Okay.
Sure can. Sure.
Yep.
Beautiful. Thank you. So it's called, the title of my talk is called What? Walt Disney was Agile. Tonight, we're going to walk through the life of Walt Disney, looking at his ambitions and how he made those ambitions happen. Walt was a unique leader in his time, and I'm claiming that his thinking and behaviours were aligned to what we know today as Agile. My name's Renee. I'm here from my office in Brisbane. I'm an Agile coach. I'm an Agile trainer. I discovered Agile in around 2010, and I'm a certified team coach with Scrum Alliance. And I'm a big Disney fan, if you haven't picked that up already. I still have my Disney books behind me from my childhood. I really love the escapism that Disney gives me, whether it's watching a movie or visiting the theme parks. I always forget about what's happening in the world when I'm immersed in Disney. As Walt Disney said, adults are only grown-up kids anyway, and that's definitely true for me. Let's explore this theory that Walt Disney was agile together. But first, let's learn who Walt was. Walter Elias Disney was born in Chicago on the 5th of December, 1901. He had an early interest in drawing. At 5 years old, he was paid to draw the horse of a neighbour and would practice drawing by copying the front page of cartoons in the newspaper. He took art and cartooning classes as a boy, and as a teenager, he worked as a cartoonist for his high school newsletter. Walt became enamoured with trains as a kid as well, and he was introduced to the world of vaudeville and motion pictures by a school friend. Walt got his first job as a commercial illustrator at the age of 18. Walt was first interested in animation in 1919 while creating film ads for animated cartoon features. He saw potential in the medium and was fascinated by the combination of drawing and technology together. He moved to Hollywood as a 21-year-old to become a live-action film director. Walt and his brother Roy set up Disney Brothers Studio to produce films. Mickey Mouse was born in 1928. In the 1950s, Walt expanded into the amusement park industry. In July 1955, Disneyland California opened. And on the 15th of December 1966, Walt Disney died of lung cancer. During his lifetime, he produced more than 100 feature films. He received 26 Academy Awards, and he holds the record for the most awards than any other person in history. Tonight we're going to learn about the events on this timeline and how Walt scaled his ambitions throughout his lifetime. Walt's ambitions started small. By running experiments and learning from customer feedback, he scaled his ambitions as time went on. He started with cartoons, then moved on to movies, attractions, theme parks, and believe it or not, a city. When he moved on to the next ambition, he left empowered and autonomous teams to continue delivering his ambitions of the past. But first, let's look at his cartoons and his animations. Now, everyone knows the success of Mickey Mouse, and it's worth noting that Mickey Mouse actually came at a time of desperation for Walt. His previous attempts of cartoons, such as Alice Comedies and Oswald the Rabbit, failed to grab the attention of audiences or investors. And so on a train ride to New York City, Walt thought of Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse was born. But I'm going to talk about the silly symphonies because that's where the learning really happened. From 1929 to 1940, it was a period of experimentation for the Walt Disney Studios, also the same time as the Great Depression. Audiences escaped their everyday lives by going to the films, and during this time, animated cartoon shorts also grew in popularity. Walt expanded on the simple gag-based cartoon by implementing film technologies like synchronized sound and music, full spectrum color, and the multiplane camera. However, it would take nearly a decade of experimentation at Disney Studios before a full-length film project could be feasibly produced. Now, cartoons usually began with the animation, then had music composed to match the action. Instead, a symphony would be a cartoon that began with a musical track and then had the action animated to it. In this way, the studio could use original compositions, public domain instrumentals, or excerpts from classical works. The symphonies acted as a testing ground for Walt and his team of animators to try out experimental techniques that they were unwilling to risk on Mickey. And they revolutionized the animation medium and became part of the standard production of cartoons still used today. While the symphonies were essential in a technological respect, they also contributed to the maturation of storytelling in animated cartoons. It would have been easy for Walt to exploit Mickey Mouse, but the symphonies provided his animators the opportunity to explore and to extend their range. Walt used the silly symphonies to test out technical innovations. Let's step through a few of them now. The first one to note is the Skeleton Dance, which was released in 1929. It was the first animated cartoon released with a soundtrack. Walt struggled to find a distributor who would take a chance on the Skeleton Dance, and he eventually found a theatre that would play it for a very limited time. The Skeleton Dance was received enthusiastically by audiences and critics everywhere. It showed Walt that audiences were open to new ideas and concepts in the genre. It also opened the door for Disney to expand and diversify their work. Diversification would prove to be one key to the company's long-lasting influence in entertainment. After the Skeleton Dance, Columbia Pictures agreed to fund one symphony per month once they saw the acceptance from the audience. The next one to note is Flowers and Trees. In 1932, Technicolor announced a new 3-strip color process that created a full spectrum with truer-to-life tones. The company approached an enthusiastic Walt Disney who was interested in color even before he was interested in sound, and discussed the use of their new process in a Disney cartoon. Technicolor was eager for the partnership because they were struggling to convince live-action studios to take on the cost of adding color. So, with the support of Technicolor, Disney Studios converted its next black and white silly symphony, Flowers and Trees, to full color. Flowers and Trees was the first commercially released film that used this 3-strip Technicolor process. Now, the artists went beyond mere color keying to find expressive and challenging ways to use the new medium. It tested out the audience's reception to color in film, and the full spectrum and artistic use of color dazzled the audiences. After Flowers and Trees, Walt agreed to produce the next 13 symphonies in full color if he could have exclusive animation rights to the Technicolor 3-color process for the next 2 years. Next one, Three Little Pigs. It was released in 1933 and was the first cartoon that had characters with a personality, that being the three pigs and the wolf. And it was the first cartoon which had a song that was sung by the characters, being Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf. Audiences loved the Three Little Pigs as it provided even more escapism from the Great Depression and allowed them to transfer their emotions onto the Big Bad Wolf. It was good timing. It was at this point that Walt saw little future in cartoon shorts if he wanted to grow his business. On the heels of the pig's success, Walt would finally be able to afford his dreams. His success fueled plans for Snow White as early as 1933, but he needed to bridge the final gaps between animation and reality before he could confidently release the film. As work began on the project, Walt relied more and more on the symphonies to give his crew a chance to develop new techniques. The last one to note is The Old Mill, which was released in 1937, and it was the first 3D film. Walt put in for the development of a $70,000 14-foot-high multi-plane camera, which was a camera that looked downward through a series of stacked animation planes to achieve depth and dimension. The mood, accentuated by the visuals courtesy of the multi-plane camera, captured the attention of audiences. The film even grabbed the Academy Award for Best Short Subject, and its reception showed that audiences could be swept up in the capturing visuals and seamless marriage of the music and action without the assistance of a defined storyline. From 1929 to 1940, Disney released 75 Silly Symphony cartoons. And Walt didn't invent animation, but he did evolve it and he defined it for his audiences. Those that followed, like Looney Tunes, were able to leverage all of the lessons that Disney learned. Through Walt's work in Silly Symphonies, he showed agility in his leadership and behaviours. He was courageous. He had a few failures at the start of his animation career, but he learned quickly and he pivoted quickly. He took a risk releasing that first Skeleton Dance film. He had no funding. He had to prove his idea to potential investors and the audience first, ultimately securing funding for the remaining animations. And Silly Symphonies coincided with the Great Depression. There was disruption happening in the world. However, he remained focused and determined to entertain his audiences. And Walt trusted his team. He couldn't have released 75 symphonies in 10 years without them. He remained focused and surrounded himself with a team that could help him realize his vision, both financially, his brother, and with a team of animators. By providing a creative outlet separate from their primary moneymaker, being Mickey Mouse, animators could experiment and develop their artistic skills. His team honed their skills over the decade. And Walt listened and learned from his customers. The encouraging national reception to the risks taken with the symphonies showed American audiences were open to new ideas in cartoons, and they developed their trust in Walt Disney. It ensured the studio that American audiences would respect a project like Snow White. The timing of Silly Symphonies helped in animation taking hold in popular culture. Walt blocked out his competition by signing with Technicolor exclusively for 2 years. His next ambition was to create a full-length film. He had that goal in his sight during the Silly Symphony period, and he used the symphonies to iterate towards his goal of Snow White. The next stage of Walt's scaling ambition was full-length feature films. The ultimate proof came with the release of 1937's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the culmination of the technical and talent development that had taken place at the studio during Silly Symphonies. The massive success of Snow White showed that animation could not only hold feature-length attention, but tell a captivating story backed by impressive imagery that could rival any live-action film. Snow White was nominated for the Best Musical Score at the Academy Awards in 1938, and the following year, Walt was awarded an honorary Oscar for the film. There were many films that followed, and in his lifetime, Walt produced more than 40 films. With his film ambition underway and his film releases being widely accepted by audiences around the world, Walt was also working on his next idea of building attractions. Now, Walt's love of trains inspired his idea to create a miniature railroad called Carrollwood Pacific Railroad in his backyard in 1950. Members of the public were able to ride the trains, and the park was extremely popular. Another key milestone in Walt's attraction ambition was the New York World Fair. Companies started coming to Walt when they were putting together attractions for the New York World Fair. They'd heard of his ability to create fun and enjoyment for the public. The 1964 fair featured 140 pavilions, and 4 of those were designed by the Walt Disney Company. And Walt took on this project for a few experiments of his own. He was interested in testing Disney entertainment with East Coast audiences to inform his decision of whether or not to build a theme park there. It gave his team a chance to experiment and develop in audio animatronics. And he also saw the opportunity for the R&D of these attractions to be paid for by the corporations he was working with. And these attractions could ultimately end up in Disney parks in the future. Throughout his attraction ambition, Walt showed agility in his leadership and behaviours. He welcomed the public into his own backyard. That was pretty courageous. At the New York World Fair was his first project where he was working in partnership with someone, in this case, 4 different companies, being the Ford Motor Company, Pepsi-Cola, General Electric, and Illinois, the state. He had a vision for a Disneyland on the East Coast, and he used the fair as an opportunity to learn more about his potential customers. And again, he trusted his team. They were able to hone their skills in audio animatronics through New York World Fair. The 4 attractions and use of audio and animatronics were the most popular and the most visited at the fair. Walt learned that East Coast audiences had an appetite for Disney, and he also learned that the public liked the attractions and provided confidence for them to be incorporated into future parks. The next step in Walt's scaling ambition is theme parks. The idea for an amusement park came from Walt's experience as a parent, taking his daughters to amusement places for their birthdays. As a parent, he was bored at those places. He felt that there should be amusement enterprises where parents and children could have fun together. He had validated enough of his ideas from his railroad park and his Disney characters to put his dream into motion. He toyed with the idea of a small playground across from his studio, but that was rejected by Burbank City Council. In 1952, Walt formed WED Enterprises to design and build his idea of Disneyland. Walt formed WED Enterprises using his own money to fund a group of designers and animators to work on the plans. Those involved became known as the Imagineers. The Imagineers were a cross-functional team, blending artists with technology and engineering, with the mission to push the boundaries of creativity. Finding and gaining approval for the land to create Disneyland took a few years. Discovery mode of Disneyland kicked off in mid-1954, where Walt sent his Imagineers to every amusement park in the US to analyze what worked and what pitfalls or problems there were in the various locations, and incorporated their findings into Disneyland's design. Walt also worried about how people got fatigued in large and crowded environments, so he studied pathways, traffic flow, and entrances and exits at places like fairs, circuses, carnivals, national parks, museums, and even the streets of New York City. Walt even urged his Imagineers to stand in line with guests to listen to them and to learn from them so that they could incorporate those learnings into the design of Disneyland. Today, the documented Imagineering process is as follows. They start off with blue sky, answering the question, what could it be? Then they move into concept, what is it? Feasibility, what will it take to make it real? And design, what are the details that will bring it to life? And then they move into the how. They move into production. How do we build it? Installation, how does it all fit together? And opening day, how did we do? Working with his Imagineers, the concept work for Disneyland began before funding was secured. Walt's vision for Disneyland was, this is a magic place. The important thing is the castle. Make it tall enough to be seen from all around the park. It's got to keep people orientated. And I want a hub at the end of Main Street where all of the other lands will radiate from, like the spokes in a wheel. Walt envisioned cohesive stories for each land. The elements in them had to fit harmoniously together, from the buildings to the signs to the trash cans. This idea, later called theming, was Walt's greatest and most unique contribution. Everything was thought of cinematically, like you were moving through a movie. You were transformed by the end of the film. The 4 parts of Disneyland are inspired by Walt's interests. Fantasyland is based on Disney's classic animated films and is the place where children of all ages can step right into a fairy tale. Tomorrowland was the promise of the future. Frontierland, spirit of exploration. Adventureland, exploring the natural environment. And you can catch the train from Main Street, USA. Disneyland opened on the 17th of July, 1955, with 18 attractions at a cost of $17.5 million. But it wasn't very successful. It's known as Black Sunday to the employees, as on that day, so many things went wrong. Firstly, it was a super, super hot day. Cars were lined up for hours to get into the car park, to get to the park. More than double the invited number of guests entered due to counterfeit tickets and people climbing fences and walls around the park to get in. Most of the attractions broke down within the first few hours, and many women lost their heels of their shoes as the bitumen on Main Street, USA had just been poured and was still soft. A plumber's strike during construction meant that Walt had to make a call on whether to have water in the water fountains for opening day or have functioning toilets. Thankfully, he chose the toilets for opening day. But Walt was determined to fix the glitches, known as defects in our world, there you go, Craig, and soon turn things around. Walt responded to media criticism with, "Disneyland will never be completed as long as there is imagination left in the world." The park's guests, however, were fascinated with Disneyland, and the numbers spoke for themselves. In the first week, there was over 160,000 visitors. By the second month, over 500,000, and by the end of September, there was over 1 million visitors to the park. Now, it might sound like Disneyland was a big bang release. However, Disneyland worked to a 1 year and 1 day timeline to construct and open 18 attractions. Following the opening, at least 1 new attraction was added each year. Attractions were revisited and either refreshed, revamped, or removed based on guest feedback. Disneyland is never complete. During the formation of Disneyland, times weren't easy. Walt faced disruptions, including the Cold War, and locally, there were labor disputes and strikes due to long working hours. However, he showed agility in his leadership and behaviours. He had a vision for how the park would be laid out in that spokes and wheel design. He envisioned themes for the lands within Disneyland. He wanted guests to feel like they were part of a movie from beginning to end. Walt took risks with Disneyland. Bankers, investors, and a lot of people within the company were strongly opposed to it. It's reported he was rejected by financial backers over 300 times before he started Disneyland. But undeterred, and just leaving the funding stuff to his brother, he sold vacation property and borrowed on his life insurance. Some employees even donated their own money to continue the project. Walt built a team that could dream up ideas better than he could. He had a vision, he did his research, and he worked with his team to create a park that delivered to his vision. He formed the Imagineers, animators from Disney Studios who were accustomed to communicating visually and possessed that spirit of innovation. Apart from the plans and drawings, documentation was light and information was mainly spread through stories amongst the employees, known today as tribal knowledge. While this was fine and okay at the time, later on when it came to add more parks to Disney, it presented challenges because not much was written down. And he did his research. He and his team were in discovery mode for a year before construction began, researching other parks. Walt's philosophy was to meet the needs of the people. He wanted to provide the space that allowed his guests to feel their emotions. Now, he also did have a knack for thinking of ideas for his guests that they didn't even know they needed. Customers were always in front of every idea and decision that Walt made. How could Walt possibly top Disneyland? In 1965, 3 months before his death, Walt announced plans to build a Disneyland in Florida, including the experimental prototype community of tomorrow, or Epcot as we know it. And East Coast Disneyland was only one small part of what Walt had in mind. The centerpiece of the new project was supposed to be an actual city run by Disney and the city was called Epcot. That was his next ambition, to build a city. Let's hear from Walt and his vision for Epcot.
We call it EPCOT, spelled E-P-C-O-T, Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. Here it is in larger scale. EPCOT will take its cue from the new ideas and new technologies that are now emerging from the creative centers of American industry. It will be a community of tomorrow that will never be completed, but will always be introducing and testing and demonstrating new materials and new systems. And EPCOT will always be a showcase to the world for the ingenuity and imagination of American free enterprise. I don't believe there's a challenge anywhere in the world that's more important to people everywhere than finding solutions to the problems of our cities. But where do we begin? How do we start answering this great challenge? Well, we're convinced we must start with the public need. And the need is not just for curing the old ills of old cities. We think the need is for starting from scratch on virgin land and building a special kind of new community. So that's what EPCOT is, an experimental prototype community that will always be in a state of becoming. It will never cease to be a living blueprint of the future, where people actually live a life they can't find anywhere else in the world. Everything in EPCOT will be dedicated to the happiness of the people who will live, work, and play here, and those who come here from all around the world to visit our living showcase. We don't presume to know all the answers. In fact, we're counting on the cooperation of American industry to provide their very best thinking during the planning and the creation of our experimental prototype community of tomorrow. And most important of all, when EPCOT has become a reality and we find the need for technologies that don't even exist today, it's our hope that EPCOT will stimulate American industry to develop new solutions that will meet the needs of people expressed right here in this experimental community.
Love the way he says industry. Walt saw faults in the way cities were built and thought to build an entire city from the ground up would fix these problems. Transportation inside the city would be handled by automated people movers, much like the monorail in Disney World today. Epcot would be a city for pedestrians and public transit. If residents owned a car for taking trips outside of Epcot and Disney World, it would be kept in a separate level below the main city, which is also how trucks carrying goods to the city would use. Walt Disney wanted the people living in Epcot to be at the forefront of technology. The idea was that the companies that had businesses at the industrial park area would use the residents as testers for new products. So people living at Epcot would have access to the cutting edge of technology. But unfortunately, Walt died before Epcot was started.
We call it EPCOT.
Stop. So, how did the Disney Corporation continue without Walt? When Walt died, there was a sense of how can we continue? The Disney Imagineers kept going with the work that was in progress, creating Disney World Magic Kingdom in Florida, which opened in 1971 and was also Brother Roy's final promise to Walt before Roy's own passing in 1971. Epcot opened in 1982 as another theme park, not the city that Walt imagined. But the good news is some of Walt's ideas from Epcot were used in Disney World. There's a utilidor, which is an underground city or a basement where 15,000 employees move around Disney World. All of the systems run through the utilidor: water, electrical, heat, and waste systems. The resort is a self-sufficient power plant with energy from solar panels and 2 jet engines burning natural gas. Excess heat is captured to chill the water for air conditioning, and the roots of hyacinth plants are used to filter sewage. But the truth is, I think Disney were lost without Walt, without his imagination and without his vision. Now, looking at the image here, scaling of his ambitions stopped when Walt died. Walt liked progress. He was ambitious. He wanted to give the public variety. And as I've tried to illustrate up to this point, he experimented, he listened to his customers, and he scaled his ideas. He was always dreaming, and he surrounded himself with the team he needed to explore and deliver his visions. Look at his quote here. I do not like to repeat successes. I like to go on to other things. Since his death, despite the CEOs that have come in after him, Disney has done the opposite of what Walt wanted. Disney has attempted to repeat what has worked in the past. I think Walt's imagination and visions have been lost forever. Let's use our own imaginations just for a few seconds and think about this question. What would the world be like today without Disney? Let's explore some of the key failures of the Disney Corporation following Walt's passing. In 1990, Euro Disney was announced and it opened 2 years later. New CEO Michael Eisner had to distinguish himself from Walt and Disney, but the announcement of Euro Disney wasn't well received. Disney Corporation had not considered the culture or audience when choosing the place to build Euro Disney. At the announcement, the French labor unions pelted Michael with eggs and flour, shouting, "Mickey, go home," in French. False assumptions led to a great loss of time, money, and even reputation for the corporation itself. Instead of analysing and learning from its potential visitors, Disney chose to make assumptions about the preference of Europeans, which turned out most of those assumptions were wrong. Just some of those assumptions were the population and tourism of Paris would equal lots of visitors to the park. Disney's policy of serving no alcohol in the park caused astonishment in a country where a glass of wine for lunch is a given. Disney thought that Monday would be a light day for visitors and Friday would be a heavy one, so they allocated their staff accordingly. But the reality was the reverse. Europeans don't take breakfast, so they downsize their restaurants. And guess what? Everyone showed up for breakfast. Disney tried to use the same teamwork model with its staff that had worked so well in America and Japan, but it ran into trouble in France. They also thought that Euro Disney would be an extended vacation location and Europeans would stay in the luxury hotels. But it seems that most Europeans regard theme parks as places for day excursions, not extended vacations, which was a big shock for the Disney Corporation. The company had invested billions in building luxury hotels next to the park that stood empty most of the time. But unperturbed, Disney Corporation pushed ahead with the planned summer 1992 opening of the $5 billion park. By the end of 1994, Euro Disney had cumulative losses of $2 billion. At this point, Disney Corporation finally listened. They changed the name from Euro, which implied commerce, to Paris for romance and magic. Fashion and food offerings were changed. Admission prices were cut by 1/3, and they attempted to put more culture into it by opening a museum of American culture in the park. The result was an attendance of 11.7 million in 1996, up from a low of 8.8 million in 1994. Ultimately, future CEO Bob Iger fixed the issues with Euro Disney. In 1999, that was the beginning of Disney California Adventure, and it was built on the parking lot across from Disneyland in Anaheim, California. Construction developers were brought in, and the park was given a very tight budget. Things were done on the cheap, and the Imagineers took a back seat. The park didn't adhere to fundamental design principles for Disney theme parks. There were no Disney characters, and there was no hub and spoke floor plan. And the teams weren't listening to each other. They kept going even when the ideas felt wrong. The grand opening on February the 8th, 2001, saw right away that guests had plenty to say about this park, noting that there was a severe lack of rides for kids, a lack of attractions, and an overall lack of Disney theming. It was a small park and it was designed for small crowds. But if you've been to Disneyland in Anaheim, this is the park that's just across the path. The expectations from the public were exactly the same. And it was equally priced, that it had fewer rides and no characters. The formula was watered down. Guests left not satisfied. When Imagineering legend John Hinge was asked what he thought of the park, he said, "I preferred the old parking lot." Ultimately, the feedback, which was very low attendance, was listened to, and the park was fixed in 2005 by new CEO Bob Iger, who expanded the park, adding more attractions, adding Pixar and Disney elements. CEO Bob Iger started to acquire other corporations to expand the repertoire of Disney, including Pixar, Lucasfilm, and Marvel. I'm sure we all have opinions of those acquisitions. The Disney Corporation was scaling, but it was just scaling in a different way through acquisitions instead. And the acquisitions also meant that creative talent was being brought into Disney. Now, you may be asking yourself, how does all of this make Walt agile? Customers were his number one. He was always thinking of ways to provide that escapism for people, whether it was short cartoons, movies, or theme parks. He was courageous. He took many risks throughout his career. He started with ideas that had no financial backing or approval. And at the time, I'm sure his ideas seemed wild and crazy, but he pursued them anyway. From Mickey Mouse to Silly Symphonies to Snow White to Disneyland to Epcot, Walt was always learning. He was always pushing the boundaries, testing the customer's appetite and learning from them. And he created the Imagineers, a cross-functional team to explore and deliver his ambitions. One of the Imagineers of Walt's time said that Walt was only interested in what you were doing today and tomorrow. He knew that yesterday couldn't be changed. All that could happen was to learn and move forward. If you think of the scale of what Walt was building, movies and theme parks, at the time, the scale of those undertakings would have been massive. And we can't say that life was easier back then because it wasn't. It's all relative. At the time, the world was going through major disruption. He couldn't have achieved what he achieved without his team and without trusting them. I've included many quotes from Walt throughout this presentation, and if you've been reading along, you'll note that his quotes are still true today. What can you learn from Walt? Let me ask you some questions to trigger your own Walt mode. What was the last courageous thing you did? As a leader, are you playing it safe or being risk averse? Do you trust your teams and empower them to deliver? Walt was always curious, and he nurtured a culture of experimentation, creativity, and learning in his team, which I think is missing from a lot of teams and organizations today. Ask yourself, what role do you play in that? Are you encouraging creativity in your teams all the time? Are you a roadblock to innovation? What can you learn from Walt and try in your own teams today? Now, I can't help but think of what the world would be today without Disney cartoons and characters, theme parks and movies. I know everyone here has had some experience with Disney. You think about it, these visions all came from Walt. He died almost 60 years ago, yet we're all still enjoying the fruits of his visions today. For the leaders here today, wouldn't you like to leave that kind of legacy? So the next time you have a decision to make for your team, for your product, for your organization, ask yourself, what would Walt do? And that is it.
Thanks, Renee.
No worries.
Some really good stuff there. Anybody got any, raise any questions for anybody? Or comments?
No questions, but a really beautiful way of putting it together and telling the story. Thank you, Renee.
No worries. Thank you.
Did I do all that? Well done, Renee.
I think that was a robotic well done, Renee.
Oh, okay, cool. Thanks. Thank you, Dan. Yo.
I'll type it.
Was
No, we
the,
can hear you now. Or maybe not.
Let's say, what was the
I
most
can hear
interesting
you.
thing you found when
Yeah, no,
researching
well done,
this,
Renee. I
Renee?
thought that was...
Thank you. Go, Craig.
I was going to say, what was the most interesting thing you found when researching this? Because obviously you went into a lot of research. Was there something that really surprised you?
I think just everything, really. It was fascinating finding out everything because I mean, especially, yeah, I don't know, all of it. Like I knew, you know, you see his quotes and things like that are around over the years, and then you go, and then I just started to kind of dig into it, and the more I dug, the more I could, you could see the behaviors and his language, and just all of that sort of stuff was. I mean, I'm sure he was not perfect. I'm sure there's another side as well, but I thought and his Epcot stuff was fascinating to me as well.
I thought the thing about all the problems on that first day and that first week, where they just got in and fixed them, was pretty inspiring. That was something I didn't know about the history.
I watched a large chunk.
I was just going to say, I think that resonates with a lot of us, doesn't it? Like, how many times do we roll something out and there's issues? So it's good to know that even regardless of whether it's a product or a theme park or something, we all experience the same issues. So it certainly humanizes him, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I'm gonna say something. I watched a fair few of those silly symphonies as well in order. And even just to see the advancement, like knowing what I know about it now and how the animators were experimenting and stuff, you can kind of see that in those cartoons as you watch them as well. So yeah, they were quite. It was interesting to watch those as well.
A couple of so some feedback and some comments in the chat. So you got a little bit of feedback there, Renee. But I guess just pulling at the questions in here. Young asked, "Is this a validation of agile thinking being what makes humans tick across the ages?"
Maybe.
And Amy asked, "It's inspiring presentation. Are you planning to share it to the public?" Aren't we the public? Hello.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, so it will be in the at the Lisbon conference. That's the 7th, 16th, 17th, 18th or something. It will be shared then, and then I don't know.
Whoever else wants it.
Me.
So Amy, if you know an audience, let us know. Excellent. Any other comments or questions? Otherwise, we'll let you all get back to your lives, or leave the office in the case of Josie, who's still sitting there. So she can go put on her Disney ears.
What would Walt do right now, Josie?
I don't know.
He would go. Oh, he probably wouldn't go home, actually. The whole what would Walt do? That actually works. Like, my husband uses it on me at least twice a week now. When I ask him a question, he goes, "What would Walt do?" I'm like, but it works. So try it. Next time you've got to answer a question, what would Walt do?
Awesome. Well, Renee, thank you very much for sharing that with us. As I said, I saw an early version and was excited that you came along to practice on it, but also to give this presentation. So join me in thanking Renee. Renee, do you have a plug for the Women in Agile group at all? Is there anything coming up in that space, or at least where people can find out about it for when you do announce the next thing?
Maybe Josie and I can have a team meeting right now. There is. We're having trouble with securing a sponsor / venue. They're being a bit MIA. So we're going with plan B. So we're looking to have one. We'll be announcing a new event for the Women in Agile by the end of, that's tomorrow. I was going to say the end of this week.
In the coming weeks.
Right.
In the coming weeks, we're aiming to have it in early November.
Yeah, that's right. So as Renee said, original plan fell through, and I'm trying to see if I can have it at my new office, but it's just depending on us moving in on time. So I'm just trying to work out some logistics.
All right. And if they want to know more about the Women Agile group, where do they go?
We have a LinkedIn group, and there's also the meetup. If you search Women in Agile Brisbane, there's a meetup page as well.
Excellent. Cool. Well, thank you, Renee. Thank you for everybody coming up. As I said, if you've got a topic you'd like to share, please send it along to us. But on that, we'll let you get back to your evenings, and we'll be announcing the next meetup very shortly. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you. See ya.
Bye.
Thanks, folks. That was great.